One paper helped hold a $317 billion industry together for 25 years, and most regulators on Earth treated it as settled truth. In late 2025, that paper, the most cited glyphosate safety evaluation ever published, was retracted. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup, the most widely applied herbicide on the planet, and one retraction did not stay academic. It hit regulation, courts, and markets at once. What followed between October 2025 and March 2026 was a collision of three forces: science, law, and politics. This episode tracks that collision from courtroom verdicts to Supreme Court strategy, from public health rhetoric to regulatory retreat, and from legal risk to deeper chemical dependence. The pressure did not disappear, it was redirected, and that redirection is the story. When a reference study collapses, every institution that relied on it has to re-justify itself in public. Courts ask whether warnings were adequate. Regulators ask whether their review pipeline was independent enough. Investors ask whether legal tail risk was massively underpriced. Farmers ask whether practical alternatives are real or still experimental. The paper at the center was published in April 2000 by Gary Williams, Robert Croze, and Ian Monroe in Regulatory Toxicology and Pharmacology. Its title was Safety Evaluation and Risk Assessment of the Herbicide Roundup and its Active Ingredient, Glyphosate, for Humans. It landed in the top 0.1% of cited glyphosate literature worldwide. For regulators, it became a core safety reference for a generation. Independent Harvard scientists later pushed the journal to reopen the review, and the handling editor-in-chief identified serious ethical failures. The paper relied on unpublished Monsanto studies rather than independent published evidence. Monsanto personnel had ghostwritten major sections. The named authors were compensated financially and did not disclose those payments. Regulatory fallout came quickly. Environmental groups demanded congressional oversight hearings. The Center for Biological Diversity called EPA reliance on ghostwritten industry work a textbook case of regulatory capture. It demanded immediate reassessment using non-industry evidence only. One paper, 25 years of regulatory cover worldwide, erased. This exploded on top of an older legal fracture. In 2015, the WHO's International Agency for Research on Cancer classified glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen. That split global interpretation and gave mass tort plaintiffs a durable evidentiary anchor. Court exposure then scaled rapidly. August 2018 brought the first courtroom reckoning. A California jury awarded groundskeeper Dwayne Johnson $289 million, the first Roundup verdict to reach a jury. Bayer shares dropped nearly 20% within days and erased billions in value. 6 months later, Edwin Hardeman won an $80 million federal verdict, and by the close of March 2019, Bayer shares had lost another 23%, trading below $16 per share. Measuring from when the Monsanto bid was first announced in May 2016 to the first major settlement in July 2020, Bayer American Depositary Receipt shares collapsed 26.1%. That erased $12.87 billion in market capitalization, about 20% of the entire Monsanto purchase price. By 2025, Bayer's market cap sat at roughly $25.65 billion, less than half the $63 billion it paid for Monsanto. That valuation gap changed the strategic objective. The problem was no longer only scientific defense. It became balance sheet survival under rolling legal uncertainty. Capital markets started treating litigation management as a core operating function. Every new verdict then became a financing event. Bayer announced what it called a historic resolution in June 2020, about $10 billion for more than 100,000 existing claims. It did not permanently stop future litigation. From 2023 to 2025, state juries kept issuing larger punitive awards: $175 million, $332 million, $2.25 billion, $2.1 billion. In August 2025, Bayer added $1.37 billion more to litigation reserves, pushing total Roundup reserves above $16 billion. This is why settlement headlines kept failing to calm the market. Legacy claims can be priced, but future claims remain open-ended until legal doctrine stabilizes. In that gap, every verdict resets expectations upward. Reserve accounting then chases a moving target. By early 2026, pressure was still rising. Active Roundup cases were estimated between 61,000 and 65,000 nationwide. More than 4,500 sat in federal multi-district litigation before Judge Vince Chabria. On February 17, 2026, Bayer proposed a $7.25 billion class settlement to cover current and future non-Hodgkin lymphoma claims over 21 years. The settlement used a proprietary point system weighing cancer subtype, treatment outcome, age, and lost earnings to set payouts. Prior settlement averages had run around $100,000 to $160,000 per claimant. Plaintiffs had to opt out by June 4, 2026 to preserve jury trial rights. Bayer also kept a contractual exit right. If opt-outs crossed a confidential threshold, the company could walk away from the entire deal. Financing was linked to an $8 billion bank facility. Legal closure depended on participation math, not headline dollars. This was risk engineering, not peace. Markets read it as unresolved risk. On announcement day, shares fell as much as 9%. Investors focused on a projected €5 billion cash outflow in 2026 that could drive free cash flow deeply negative. Litigation provisions rose from 7.8 billion to 11.8 billion euros. The market saw continuation, not finality. Bayer's real long-term bet shifted to the Supreme Court. In January 2026, the court granted certiorari in Monsanto Company versus Durnell. The case came from Missouri, where John Durnell won $1.25 million after convincing a jury Roundup caused non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Oral argument was set for April 27, 2026. The case turns on federal preemption under FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Monsanto argues the statute bars states from imposing warning duties different from federal labeling requirements. EPA repeatedly approved Roundup labels without a cancer warning. EPA also told manufacturers adding one could constitute illegal misbranding. Plaintiffs argue FIFRA is not a blanket liability shield. They say state tort law fills safety gaps when federal oversight is underfunded or captured. If preemption is affirmed broadly, tens of thousands of failure-to-warn claims could collapse at once. If rejected, state-level exposure remains open indefinitely for every EPA-registered chemical. That binary outcome would ripple far beyond one company. Preemption strength influences product label strategy across the whole agrochemical portfolio. It also changes insurer pricing for future liability. One decision could reset litigation economics for an entire sector. This legal fight ran inside a political shockwave. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. became HHS Secretary and brought Maha rhetoric into federal health politics. The commission cited 1 billion pounds of pesticide use per year. It named atrazine, glyphosate, and chlorpyrifos as central drivers of chronic disease risk in children. MAHA language directly attacked EPA process legitimacy. It accused the agency of leaning on industry-funded ghostwriting and pressuring staff toward approvals while minimizing risk signals. It also highlighted FIFRA's 15-year review cycle as too slow for emerging hazards. For a moment, sweeping regulatory change looked plausible. What happened instead was an administrative pivot. The Trump-Zeldin EPA prioritized macro stability and agricultural output continuity over structural chemical rollback. Final MAHA strategy avoided immediate bans and major FIFRA redesign. It directed EPA to work with agricultural and food stakeholders, including the chemical sector, to sustain confidence in existing review systems. A $1 billion interagency package replaced the expected crackdown path. It included a $100 million NIH grand prize on exposure science, a $100 million ARPAH robotics challenge for weeding, and a $30 million EPA challenge on alternatives to pre-harvest desiccation. Populist pressure was converted into voluntary innovation funding. Binding restrictions were largely deferred. This pivot mattered politically because it changed the timeline of conflict. Voluntary programs can absorb public pressure without forcing immediate regulatory rupture. They also preserve room for industry participation and narrative repair. They do not answer the legal question driving active tort exposure. Politics cooled, while litigation stayed hot. At the same time, chemical approvals continued. EPA reauthorized dicamba for over-the-top use on genetically modified soy and cotton across 34 states. It was the fourth such approval since 2016. 3 earlier registrations had already been vacated by federal courts over FIFRA violations and drift damage. A 2021 Inspector General report had already warned that EPA deviated from standard scientific procedure and altered peer-reviewed information in dicamba review flow. Even with that warning, reauthorization advanced. The message to markets was continuity under contestation. Litigation and policy moved in opposite directions at once. Another flashpoint came in November 2025. EPA approved isocycloserum, a PFAS-class persistent pesticide, for food crop use. Concerns included reduced testicle size, liver toxicity, and weak child protection buffers. Those concerns did not stop approval. State responses then split sharply. California blocked retail neonicotinoid sales for non-agricultural use from January 1, 2025. It also advanced legislation to ban non-agricultural glyphosate use by 2028. New York introduced a full paraquat ban bill. By early 2026, 13 states were weighing paraquat restrictions. In parallel, farm-heavy states advanced liability shields. The Modern Ag Alliance, with more than 360 groups, backed bills stating EPA-approved labels satisfy all state warning duties. Georgia and North Dakota enacted such laws in 2025, while Florida, Kansas, Kentucky, and Missouri advanced similar bills. That split created a legal patchwork with rising transaction cost. Product risk became jurisdiction-specific instead of nationally coherent. Compliance strategy now had to track both federal labels and state legislative calendars. Uncertainty rose for growers, retailers, and manufacturers at the same time. At the federal level, the March 2026 draft Farm Bill included Section 10,205, titled Uniformity of Pesticide Labeling Requirements. It would preempt states, courts, and local bodies from penalizing warnings beyond EPA labels. That would weaken the legal basis of thousands of toxic tort claims immediately. Congressional conflict over this section was expected to intensify through 2026. Industry strategy did not move toward dechemicalization. It moved toward redundancy. Trait stacking expanded chemical compatibility rather than reducing chemical reliance. Revenue exposure to any one active ingredient was intentionally diluted. U.S. herbicide market projections reflect that strategy. The market is expected to reach $15.31 billion by 2031, growing around 5% annually. Syngenta and MS Technologies plan a 2029 soybean stack tolerant to glyphosate, glufosinate, 2,4-D-choline, and multiple HPPD inhibitors. Bayer's Viconic soybeans add tolerance to 5 distinct classes. Stacking changes legal and agronomic risk distribution. If one active ingredient is restricted, the package still functions through other tolerated chemistries. That preserves field utility and revenue continuity simultaneously. Redundancy is being designed as a litigation hedge. Farm economics also shifted with this model. Complex seed and chemistry programs often carry 25 to 40% price premiums at farm level. That protects supplier revenue if one chemistry is restricted by litigation or regulation. Dependency is distributed, not removed. Biologicals became the parallel growth story. The U.S. biologicals market was about $5.1 billion in 2025 and is projected near $13.7 billion by 2034, with growth above 11% annually. About 80% of crop protection firms planned larger biological offerings in 2026. Development can be about 50% faster, with cost and emissions advantages under certain pathways. Those advantages are real, but conditional. Development costs can run up to 95% lower than synthetics, and emissions estimates can be 69 to 91% lower. Field deployment constraints remain substantial. Performance, logistics, and shelf stability still limit substitution speed. Live microbial systems need cold chain handling below 4 degrees Celsius, adding roughly 12 to 15% to landed costs. Typical shelf life is around 90 days. Biologicals also often lack the broad, immediate knockdown profile growers expect from conventional synthetics. That keeps adoption uneven by crop and region. Program-level economics show the gap. Generic synthetic herbicide programs can run near $16 to $20 per acre. Biohybrid alternatives often cost more while requiring tighter handling discipline. The practical trend is co-formulation, biological components layered onto synthetic foundations. This reduces load without abandoning legacy control performance. This is why full substitution narratives often fail in commercial seasons. Growers optimize for reliability under weather and labor uncertainty, not for single variable purity targets. Any new program has to match timing, efficacy, and cost windows in the field. Until that happens, hybridization remains the practical bridge. A forced full glyphosate exit would be macroeconomically disruptive. U.S. chemical input costs are modeled to rise around 2 to 2.5 times. Annual production costs could increase by roughly $1.9 billion. Substitution through heavy tillage would create a separate climate penalty. That tillage shift could release up to 34 million tons of stored soil carbon. It would also reverse decades of no-till gains tied to conservation and erosion management. Transition design matters as much as endpoint choice. A bad transition can worsen both cost and environmental outcomes. International policy pressure adds another layer. EU Farm to Fork targets a 50% pesticide reduction by 2030. USDA modeling suggests broad adoption could cut global agricultural output by up to 11%. Projected food price effects are correspondingly large. The same modeling shows global food prices potentially up 89%, with fruit and vegetable prices in some regions up as much as 247%. It also projects 185 million more people in food insecurity under an 1,100 calorie per day access threshold. Those are system-level consequences, not marginal changes. Policy ambition must be matched with transition capacity. Europe is also tightening residue rules as trade leverage. In December 2025, the Food and Feed Omnibus proposal pushed maximum residue limits for non-EU approved pesticides toward limit of quantification levels, effectively near zero. More than $5.4 billion in U.S. exports to the EU, including soybeans, corn, and tree nuts, could be exposed. Stringency changes transmit through trade channels quickly. For exporters, this converts compliance into market access risk. Residue policy is no longer only a domestic health rule. It is a border filter that can reshape trade direction rapidly. Countries with weaker testing infrastructure absorb higher adjustment costs first. Empirical estimates suggest each 10% increase in residue stringency reduces agricultural imports from developing countries by nearly 15%. That creates asymmetric burden on lower capacity exporters. Compliance cost rises where monitoring infrastructure is weakest. Europe's own neonicotinoid experience illustrates unintended effects. Oilseed rape yields fell about 4%, reducing output by roughly 912,000 tons, near Romania's annual production scale. Input costs rose by about 120 million euros due to additional pyrethroid sprays. Estimated GDP damage reached about 876.4 million euros annually. The ecological irony ran equally sharp. Targeted seed coatings were replaced by repeated broad-spectrum foliar applications, with wider non-target exposure risk. EU canola imports climbed from 63,000 tons in 2016 to 811,000 tons in 2022. Production was shifted outward, often to regions with weaker standards. That externalization creates a familiar policy loop. Risk is reduced in one jurisdiction, but displaced into another with thinner safeguards. Aggregate ecological pressure may not fall. It may just move geographically. Without that lens, policy success can be overstated. As of March 2026, forward scenarios remain genuinely uncertain. Analysts placed 45% probability on status quo continuity with preemption wins. Partial restriction with ongoing fragmentation carried 40% probability. Broad liability expansion and major active ingredient exits were assigned 15%. Those probabilities matter because investment decisions are happening now, not after legal closure. Companies are allocating R&D and portfolio capital under uncertain doctrine. Farmers are committing to seed and chemistry mixes before final policy signals arrive. Uncertainty itself becomes a direct system cost. What sits behind those probabilities is enormous. Roughly $317 billion in agrochemical revenue and a biologicals frontier trending toward $27.9 billion depend on outcome paths. Industry has responded by building chemical biological redundancy, not by accepting rapid dechemicalization. Legal pressure changed architecture, more than direction. Two decision nodes will matter most: Supreme Court resolution in Monsanto versus Durnell and congressional outcomes on Section 10,205 will shape how risk is allocated. The deeper fight is over institutional authority: juries, federal regulators, legislators, or corporate evidence pipelines. The conflict is active, and the endpoint is still unresolved.